Okay, Unit 7 is about prayer and worship. And you've got two readings for this. One is a couple of essays by the great modern philosopher, late modern philosopher, Immanuel Kant, often cited as the greatest philosopher since Aristotle. And although the readings that you've got aren't usually taken aren't from his sort of masterpieces of philosophy, they're more from sort of general writings, from lectures on ethics, I think they're from. So these would be lectures that would be given to a general audience, which Kant did apparently. He was very popular. He packed wherever audiences gathered, he packed those places with his lectures, which you might be surprised if you do the readings. So that's one reading, and the two lectures are called Prayer and De Cultu Externo, which means on outward observance is the closest, I guess. Which is talking about sort of worshipful practices like, for example, the pillars of Islam, things like pilgrimages and fasts. Kant, you might gather, is rather anti such things, and he appears to be not only both anti-Islam but also anti-Catholicism. He's very much a Protestant, but he is a Christian. And as is the other the other philosopher that you're reading, who is still alive, Eleanor Stump, is at the University of St. Louis, I think. And her article takes sort of the opposite view from Kant. Kant argues that prayer, as he puts it, is objectively unnecessary, by which he means it serves no real purpose. If something is objectively effective, that means it has an influence on the world. So if prayer was objectively efficacious, it would achieve its goal, including communicating with God. So it's pretty radical view for a Christian to take, to argue that in fact prayer doesn't achieve even that purpose of communicating with God, let alone getting God to do what you want. So that's his view. He says it does have a subjective purpose, which means it has a value to you. And actually there are studies, people have done studies that say that people who pray recover faster than people who don't. Now, the people who conduct these studies don't say that this proves that God is helping them. What they tend to argue is that prayer inculcates in the person praying a positive attitude. It makes you think, well, I'm doing something about my disease, and it makes them feel sort of hopeful and optimistic, and that is what helps them recover better. So that would be a subjective effect. It doesn't really have an effect on anything outside in the world, but it has an internal effect. It produces a valuable state in you. Now, the state that Kant is talking about is not a bodily state like physical health or anything like that. It's the right kind of moral attitude. So that's the value of prayer for him, and we'll get into that in a second. But I want to start, I'm going to do this in a slightly strange way. Stump's article is a long one, and sort of the first half of the article is setting up the classical problem of prayer, at least her version of the classical problem of petitionary prayer. Petitionary prayer, by the way, is simply prayer that asks for something. You know, a petition is where you sign something because you want something to happen. So petitionary prayer is prayer that asks for stuff. you might say there are other forms of prayer, just like prayer that says, "Oh God, you know." I've already mentioned the Monty Python movie Meaning of Life. Actually, I probably mentioned it to my other class. But there is a Monty Python movie, one of their lesser-known movies. It's their last movie, made in the 80s, called The Meaning of Life, and it's a series of sketches. And in that movie, there's a scene where an Anglican vicar who's at a school. By the way, I went to a school like that where, and in England, certainly when I was growing up, there is no separation of church and state. In fact, religious education is required, and we had to go to morning assemblies where there would be prayer and hymns. So this depicts one of them, and he leads everyone in prayer, and he starts by saying, "Oh God, you're so huge. We're all really impressed down here, I can tell you. Please don't." And then he goes into a hymn that's all about asking God not to kill and eat us. You know, please don't barbecue your flock and stuff like that. Presumably something like that. Well, he is asking for something. He's asking not to be eaten by God. But the other part where it's just sort of saying, "Oh God, you're amazing. You're so much better than us," that wouldn't be petitionary prayer. That would be supplicatory prayer or something. That would be prayer that just says, admires God for his amazingness. And that might, even that would say in itself is pretty much worthless. But that's not what Stump is talking about. Stump is specifically focusing on prayer that asks for something. Not necessarily, you know, she does mention an example of a little kid asking for a jackknife, which I guess is a penknife. I don't know if they call them that anymore. Which just dates her article, or at least dates her understanding of kids, because even in the late 70s they probably would have been asking for an Atari. So the problem she's looking at is specifically one of asking for either for something to happen or for some state of affairs. It doesn't have to be selfish. It can be asking for good things to happen to someone you love, or even somebody you don't know. You know, just recently, the basketball player, the player for the Indiana Pacers, Paul George, who was practicing for the US national team and suffered a very horrific and grisly injury on screen, where basically the bottom half of his leg just snapped in half. And immediately on Twitter there were all these hashtags that said "Pray for Paul George." That would be petitionary prayer, because you're asking for him to recover fully from this horrific looking injury, and for his, you know, career not to be derailed for more than the time it takes to heal. Just today, Robin Williams died. Apparently they're saying he might have committed suicide. So, you know, if somebody were to say, "I pray for Robin Williams' soul," that would also be petitionary prayer. It's not asking for something for you, but it's asking for that something good happen to somebody else. Sorry if you hadn't heard about Robin Williams, but you would have eventually. Okay, so what is the puzzle about petitionary prayer? Well, as Stump puts it, essentially this way. She puts it in a way that philosophers tend to do. She summarizes it in a series of numbered propositions, which philosophers like because it's very clear, but non-philosophers can find a little bit forbidding. This is on page 355, 356 of your printout, which actually you can't see the numbers because they got cut off, but trust me, those are the numbers. And it goes on to 357 as well. But essentially what it adds up to is this. And as she says, this is sort of related to the problem of evil. And if you remember, the problem of evil was, how is it that bad things happen if God is all-powerful and all-loving? Because if he's all-loving, he would want bad things not to happen to us, just as we don't want bad things to happen to our children. and God is all-powerful, so God can prevent any bad things happening, and if he's both of those, he doesn't want them to happen and he can prevent them from happening, so they shouldn't happen, and yet they do happen. So that's the problem. This is a similar puzzle in that it's also a puzzle because of the features of God. If God is all-powerful and all-knowing and all-loving and all-good, all of these things, all the alls, then if the world could be made better, then he will know about it and he will make it better. And if changing the world would in fact make it worse, then he wouldn't do it, because he would know that that would make it worse. So, in effect, the world is going to be exactly as God has determined it should be, and God, being perfect, cannot be wrong about this. But notice what you're doing. If you're asking for something, you're asking for a certain kind of thing to happen. And here's the deal. Either the world would be better if this thing happens. If that is the case, then God would do it anyway, because God is perfect, God would know it's better, and God would want it to be better, and God can make it better. So, if it's good, it will automatically happen. God will make it happen, without you asking for it. If it's bad, God won't do it, because God won't do something that is bad. It is never logically necessary for an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good being to make the world worse than it would otherwise be. It is never logically impossible for an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good being to make the world better than it would otherwise be. That is number 7 of her list of propositions. Stump, that is. So, prayer, asking for things, looks pretty pointless, because either God will do it anyway, or God won't do it even if you ask, because he shouldn't do it. It's like, I don't know, if somebody you know asking for, it's like a kid asking for a flamethrower. You know, you're not going to give the kid the flamethrower. And if God knows what you're asking for would achieve bad things, he's not going to give it to you. Or, you know, a parent knows what a kid likes, so the kid asking for something that they really like and have made obvious that they really like, well, the parents, if they can afford it, will have already got that for the kid for Christmas. So the asking is pointless. That's the challenge of petitionary prayer. It's pointless. It doesn't do anything. So why do it? And in fact, Kant goes further than to say that it's pointless. At one point on page 101 of your handout, he says this: prayer appears to be a presumptuous act and an act of distrust in God. Remember, this is someone who is definitely Christian. He's certainly not an atheist or a non-believer. So the fact that he's saying this is pretty radical. It's easy for an atheist to say, you know, prayer is pointless because they don't believe in God, but he believes in God. Prayer appears to be a presumptuous act and an act of distrust in God. It seems to imply distrust in God's knowledge of what is good for us. Continuous, unremitting prayer may be construed as an attempt to coerce God by constant begging into granting our desires. That reminds me of an old Simpsons episode where the kids want to go to this water park and they just ask Homer constantly from morning till night, can we go to the, you know, can we go to Splash Mountain, can we go to Splash Mountain, can we go, and he keeps saying no, 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 and eventually he says, all right, because he can't stand it anymore. That's sort of what Kant is saying prayer is like towards God. But God is perfect, and God won't get worn down in the way that the very imperfect Homer does, and God will do what is right anyway. And Kant adds some extra points that make petitionary prayer particularly pointless. This is something that you might find shocking coming from a Christian. This is on page 99. To wish to converse with God is absurd. We cannot talk to one we cannot intuit, and as we cannot intuit God but can only believe in him, we cannot converse with him. So, all of these people who say talk to God, form a relationship with God, Kant is having none of that. We can't even intuit God. We cannot form a conception of God, because God is too beyond our ken, too outside of our mortal imaginations to really capture. And also, this is connected with the idea that God is outside of space and time, because God is changeless. That's another problem. There are other features of God that Stump sort of mentions that make prayer pointless, and that is, if God is outside of time, then God is not in time with us, so that we can sort of converse with God as we would somebody else who's in time with us. But conversing with God would be like trying to converse with the dinosaurs and people in the future at the same time. If God is outside of time, he is beyond us and before us at the same time, and everything is laid out before him at the same time. Our words won't reach him. Okay, so Kant, prayer is pretty pointless. Well, pointless objectively. That is, it won't achieve anything outside of us. However, he does say that subjectively prayer has a point, for our sakes, not as a communication with God, but because, he says, humans can only think by putting things into words, and if someone wants to produce for himself a lively representation of his pious wishes and his trust in God, putting it into prayer form is the only way he can. So, prayer is a good way of sort of announcing to yourself what you should do, because as Kant goes on to make clear, what it is to be a righteous or pious person is not to do religious things. It's not to do churchy things. They can be useful. Public prayer can be useful to the extent that being around a group of like-minded people, focusing their minds on a similar thing, can help us to focus like a laser. It's like studying for an exam. It helps to be in a group of people also studying for an exam, or like, Alcoholics Anonymous. If you want to quit alcohol, it helps to be in a support group. So church, in effect, is like a support group for Kant. That is, God doesn't care about a bunch of us getting together in a particular building and saying particular words. God does not care about such things. God doesn't care about in the second piece, De Cultu Externo, Kant sort of hammers this point home. There's all these kind of things that certain religions say you ought to do, certain rituals, and those are worse than useless, according to Kant. He draws a distinction between the religion of currying favour, at least that's the translation, because of course Kant wrote in German, and it's a slightly old-fashioned translation. A better way would be brown-nosing religion. There's the religion of brown-nosing, sucking up. That way is where you do certain things because you think God's told you to, and it's as if there's a checklist. God's given you a checklist of things to do, hoops to jump through. Okay, do this. And of course, this is a not subtle dig at religions like Islam, in particular Islam, the 5 pillars, that tells you, you've got to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, you've got to fast during Ramadan, and so on. So there's a very specific list, and pray 5 times a day facing in the right direction. These are outward observances, which is what De Cultu Externo means. These are, physical manifestations of worship. And a lot of religions say that that's perhaps the most important thing you've got to do. And Kant says, no, it's pretty much worthless. The only worth it has is insofar as it inculcates the real valuable part of religion, which is leading a good life. So he contrasts the religion of currying favour, brown-nosing, sucking up, with the religion of a good life. And a good life is if God wants anything for us, which Kant believes he does, it's for us to live right, to do morally correct things. Now Kant is most famous for being one of the greatest moral philosophers of all time, and Kantian ethics has been hugely influential and is still to this day perhaps the most influential school of ethical thought amongst philosophers in America. It competes with something called utilitarianism, but both of them are more or less secular moral theories. They don't say do what God tells you. They give you a way of working out what is the right thing to do that works whether or not there is a God. Kant believes there is a God, but he also believes that morality is like math. It's something that you can work out by using your powers of reason. And God has given us this ability, and God has given us free will, and combining the two, it is entirely within our power to do the right thing. It just requires us recognizing it, thinking about it, and forcing ourselves to do it. And if we do that, which is hard, because living right doesn't mean just, as Kant points out, people like the idea that God has just given us a checklist of things to do. Go to church on Sunday, you know, put $10 in the collection plate, things like that. Because those are things you can just do and say, great, now I can go off and party and have a good time and forget about God. It's like things that you can check off your list and then forget about them until they're due again. That's easy. Much harder is to constantly be doing the right thing, to be living right every second of your life. That's much harder, but that's what God really wants for us, according to Kant. So prayer and worship, insofar as they're external displays, they're bad. They only have value insofar as doing them is like a ritual that helps you to focus. It's like I don't know, certain rituals help people to focus. If you ever watch basketball players, they do the same thing every time they go to the free throw line. Why? Because it helps them focus. Okay, if prayer helps you focus on what you should do, you know, if saying I've got to do this, this is what I should do. I mean, for example, he approves of the Lord's Prayer, which Stump also talks about, because that doesn't ask for anything specific. It just lays out general rules, thy will be done, and reminds us, gotta keep our eye on what God wants for us, which is the right thing, which is doing the right thing. There's no specific things like you know, giving 10% of your income to the church or anything like that. Nothing that specific. Kant insists that prayer must have general content, not particular or specific. But that's the value of prayer, is to focus one's mind. Definitive prayers for specific things, this is a quote on page 100, definitive prayers must be regarded as presumptuous. They breathe a perverse conceit. Definitive prayers are unbelieving. If I attach a condition to my prayer, I doubt the certainty that it will be completely granted. The prayer of faith cannot be definitive, but must be general. Whosoever sets God a task and desires fulfillment in his own fashion has no trust in God. And this is basically the puzzle that Stump talks about. If you're asking for something, if you think you have to ask for it, otherwise God won't do it, then either you think you know better than God what should be done, and you say, God, you might not have thought of this, but this would be really good. You'll be glad I suggested it to you. You know, that's sort of the attitude you're taking. Or, so you're sort of assuming God is up there. Oh, yeah, crap. Yeah, you're right. I should do that. Or so you either think you know better than God, or you think that you can get God to change his mind. But if he's perfect, he shouldn't change his mind. And if he's outside of time, everything's already pretty much decided anyway. So that's why Kant rejects the idea of prayer. And he also rejects the idea of worship insofar as worship involves this kind of external display. That's what he's talking about in De Cultu Externa. Alright, so back to Stump. Stump sets up the problem in the first part of her article this puzzle that, you know, either the prayer is pointless because either God will do it, in which case there's no point to asking it, or God won't do it, in which case there's no point to asking for it. But either way, there's no point. And she tries to come up with a way that makes prayer, asking for something, petitionary prayer, the worst kind of prayer, Kant might say, have a point. And the first thing she insists on is something called anthropomorphism. Now, anthropomorphism is probably a word you might have come across. It means putting human qualities onto something that is not human. So, for example, Mickey Mouse is an anthropomorphized rodent, because actually mice don't wear gloves and walk around on 2 legs. That may be news to you, but it's true. That's an example of anthropomorphism. The anthropomorphism that she's talking about is attributing human qualities to God. Now, for Kant, that is an awful thing to do. Kant is beyond our power to intuit, remember, for Kant. We can't even imagine God. And to put human qualities on him encourages just the worst kind of attitude, as Kant says. You know, it makes us, if we think of God as like a human prince, then this encourages all this kind of, you know, kowtowing and sucking up business that is not the kind of, you know, because the way you behave to someone who's much richer and more powerful than you is you tend to try to please them and try to influence them. You try to win their favor. That's not what you've got to do with God. It's not going to work, and it's an insult to God's perfect nature. Whereas Stump says, how does she put it? She puts it this way. A certain sort of this is on page 359. A certain sort of anthropomorphism is as much a part of Christianity as is Thomas's, that's St. Thomas Aquinas, perfect being theology. Now, perfect being theology is this view that I've been calling theism, that God is, you know, all powerful, all knowing, all loving, and all the alls. That's the view of God as omni-everything that she attributes to Aquinas. It predates Aquinas, but he certainly did the most to sort of spell out its implications. Now, of course, Christianity very much anthropomorphizes God insofar as Jesus is God. Now, of course, that's something that puzzles, for example, Muslims. How can Jesus be both? How can God be Jesus and Jesus is Father at the same time? You may be puzzled by that yourself. Muslims think that this smacks of polytheism. Incidentally, the Muslim attitude, or at least the fundamentalist Muslim attitude towards polytheism, is in the news at the moment. That fundamentalist offshoot Islamic. Most Muslims would say they're not true Muslims, and you know, could point to many reasons why. But certainly, this idea they have cornered the Zahidis, I believe the name is, a sort of Kurdish sect, I think, on a mountain, in a mountain region. There were 40,000 of them there, but thanks to the bombing and help from the Kurds in Iraq, they've managed to get 20,000 of them off. But they sort of surrounded them and gave, this is ISIS, this fundamentalist Islamic group. They surrounded them and gave them they told them they had to convert or be killed. And actually there is sort of precedent for this in what the Muslims in the early days of Islam did. They did to all groups except Christians and Jews, because Christians and Jews were monotheistic. But what Muslims have always regarded as shirk, or very bad, is this idea of polytheism. Well, Christianity looks a little polytheistic insofar as Jesus is a separate being from God. But Jesus certainly is anthropomorphized insofar as he's actually a human. But if we think of God existing now, or Kant would say that's the wrong way to talk about it because God is outside of time, but if we think of God as a being with whom we can interact, as most Christians do, that's anthropomorphizing. And actually, the Quran is guilty of a little bit of anthropomorphism. It talks about God's hands and God's face at various parts, and this is something that Muslim interpreters have wrestled with at various stages, whether or not that can be taken literally or just should be taken as metaphorically. Okay, so anthropomorphism simply means attributing human properties. I mean, if we say that God loves, that in itself seems to be attributing human qualities to God. So, she's going to push the anthropomorphizing line. And she suggests that we should think of God, the relationship. We should think of God as encouraging a relationship with us. In fact, she suggests that we should view God as analogous to a human friend. However, if we think of God as like a human, and the relationship that should be developed between God and human is analogous to friendship, she says there's a problem, as she puts it. But if this on page 618. Oh no, that's the wrong number. That's from a different edition. Okay, but if the relationship between God and human beings is to be one which at least sometimes can be accurately represented as the love of true friendship, then there is a problem for both parties to the relationship, because plainly it will not be easy for there to be a friendship between an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good person, God, and a fallible, finite, imperfect person, you. Okay, so she says, here's the challenge. We're supposed to form this relationship. Here's the problem. How can we form a relationship between two such unequals? And she suggests prayer is actually the answer to petitionary prayer specifically, is the answer to this challenge of forming a relationship between two such unequals. She says, okay, what are the biggest dangers in an unequal friendship? And she says, essentially, there are two. These are both dangers for the lesser party, for the human, for the weaker or lower friend. The first danger is of becoming slavish or overcome. That is, think of an entourage. Celebrities are supposed to have entourages, or posses, depending on which celebrity we're talking about. Members of this entourage, what do you think of them? Actually, but they are subject to both kinds of danger. On the first hand, you think of them as kind of toadies or suck-ups. They become slavish and they lose all personality. You don't necessarily think of them as having their own personality. I haven't seen, there was a show, Entourage, on, what was it, HBO for a long time. I never saw it, but so I'm not talking specifically about that. I'm just talking about, imagine someone whose job it is to hang around with a famous person, to be a part of his or her entourage. I don't think we'd find such a person very admirable, particularly if, suppose we knew them before, and now we find out they started dressing like the famous person that they're hanging out with, and they've started liking all the things that he or she likes, and they don't have their own independent person. They've lost any vestige of independent personality. Now they dress the way this person dresses. Now they claim to like everything that this person likes, and so on. In other words, they're losing their identity. They're becoming subsumed by this person. So that's the first danger, of becoming overcome or slavish, becoming just losing all individuality and freedom, and just becoming a mini-me of this of the more powerful member of the friendship. That's the first danger, the danger of being overcome, absorbed. The second danger is if this person is powerful and able to provide just about anything, in human terms they would just be rich, then the person who hangs out with them and gets stuff off them is in danger of becoming spoilt. Again, imagine a member of the entourage who thinks they're pretty awesome because they're now a member of this entourage, and who say, well, I can get anything, I can get this because I'm with so-and-so. They become completely obnoxious because they think, oh, I can get that. I can get you Knicks tickets. I'll just ask, so-and-so, my rich friend. So there is the danger of becoming spoilt, like rich children or royals, not the ones in the song, but members of royal family. Because of their power and virtue of their connections, they often become tyrannical, willful, indolent, self-indulgent. Spoilt brats, like Veruca Salt in the movie Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, or Willy Wonka in the Chocolate Factory, which is the better movie. So those are the two dangers, becoming, and as I said, I think it's a good analogy to think of a member of an entourage, someone who thinks they're in a friendship with this famous person, but because of their inferior position, there's this danger that they lose all their personality, or that they just become obnoxious and spoiled. Okay, those are the dangers in an unequal friendship, but we're supposed to try and achieve this unequal friendship, says Stump, between humans and God. And she suggests that prayer forms a sort of buffer to avoid the friendship devolving into a using, as she puts it. Either the superior member of the pair will use the lesser as his lackey, or the lesser will use the superior as his personal power source. Either way, it's an unhealthy relationship. So prayer prevents a buffer. She says, if instead of God just giving us what we need, so if God just gave us what we needed without us asking, we'd become spoilt, she says. However, if we have to ask, which is what petitionary prayer is, then it guards us against spoiling, and because, she says, in praying for himself, he makes an explicit request for help, and he thereby acknowledges a need or a desire and his dependence on God for satisfying that need or desire. If he gets what he prayed for, he will be in a position to attribute his good fortune to God's doing and to be grateful to God for what God has given him. The uncertainty makes a person grateful for what he or she receives, and therefore not spoiled. So, having to ask for something guards against being spoiled. It also guards against being overcome. And here she draws an analogy with a teacher. She talks about, suppose a teacher just gives help to a person without them asking. The danger is they will become passive. Either they'll be pissed off and say, who asked you? Incidentally, I've never had that happen, and I can't really imagine someone doing that, but Stump says it would be healthy for them to say, basically, get lost, stop sticking your nose in my business. But if instead the teacher, even though the teacher can see the student struggling, just holds off and waits for them to ask for help, that guards against them being overcome. So it's good for the student needs help, but it would be bad, says Stump, if the teacher just helped. Now, there's a problem that Stump herself sees with this. She says, what about cases of people who are incapable of asking? Either because they don't know about God, because, they've never been given the good word. Maybe they live in tribes in the Amazon and they believe that there are spirits and they don't know about Christianity. or they're just severely disabled and they're incapable of forming prayers. Does that mean that God shouldn't help them? God should only help those who ask. And here she says, no, God is like a good father. God, and she imagines the analogy she gives is a father with two different children. One child recognizes the father and asks for stuff. That's like the person who's capable of praying. And then God should only do things for this person, for this son, when he asks. But the other one has various disabilities and is, for whatever reason, incapable of asking the father and might not even know that the father is there. Just like someone who is unaware of God. A good father will nonetheless help this kid out. They won't let this kid starve because the kid can't ask for food. The father will take care of the kid. And a good God would be the same. But notice the implications of this. In effect, Stump is saying this: prayer only has a point for people who believe in God. For people who believe in God, they're not going to get anything unless God asks. But for people who don't believe in God, they're going to get stuff without asking, because God would be a jerk if he didn't help people who didn't know about him. So it sounds like petitionary prayer only really has a point for people who believe in God. And even then, she has to admit that sometimes God will do stuff for you without you asking, and sometimes God won't do stuff for you when you do ask, which of course is a bit of a puzzle right there. Why isn't he doing stuff when you ask it? I mean, I guess with the teacher, people are always asking me, give me the answers on the test, and of course I say no. But if somebody says, will you help me understand this, I would say sure. So presumably that's the analogy with God. If you're asking for the right thing, then God will help you. And she gives support for this view of prayer with a story in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, where the disciples see Jesus praying, and they say, "Hey, Jesus, why didn't you teach us to pray? John the Baptist taught his followers to pray. Why won't you teach us?" And he said, "I will teach you. I was just waiting for you to ask." And then he teaches them the Lord's Prayer. But she says, but notice, he waited for them to ask, which is, she claims, is support for her idea that you have to ask. Now, how does this solve the puzzle that that she presented in the first half of her article? Well, remember, she presented it in the form of an argument with a set of premises. And the argument is what is known as a valid argument, which means if all the premises are true, that would guarantee the conclusion, and the conclusion was prayer is pointless. Now, she's argued that prayer is not pointless, so she has to say which of the premises turns out to be wrong. And her claim is that the premise that turns out to be wrong is number 7, which it's on page 356. It is never logically necessary for an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good being to make the world worse than it would otherwise be. It is never logically impossible for an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good being to make the world better than it would otherwise be. Conclusion. So she suggests that there are some things that even an omnipotent being cannot do. Remember, actually, we came across this when we were talking about the features of God. God can't make a square circle. And one of the things that God is not supposed to be able to do is make free beings freely do something. This is actually the basis of the free will defense against the problem of evil. So, if what God wants is for us to freely ask for God's kingdom on earth, he can't do that, because if he makes us, we're not doing it freely. So there are some things that we can only achieve for ourselves. We have to contribute something. And she suggests that asking for something is one of those things. But is she suggesting that that God's plan, she would appear to be siding with someone like Swinburne, and Swinburne, who we read a version of his Theodicy, his response to the problem of evil, and he takes the view that God has left the future of the world very much up in the open. And there are a lot of religious philosophers who do not like this view, a lot of theologians who do not like this view. In fact, I think most Christians believe that God has a plan for the world that is going to come about. Certainly St. Thomas Aquinas believes this. There is a plan, God has a plan for the world, and in fact, being outside of time, God can see that this plan will come about, because he can see the future as well. Whereas Stump appears to be committed to the view that God's plan might not come to pass. If we don't ask for something, if we don't ask for the right thing, then God can't bring it about. God can't make us freely want something. So it's just possible that we could screw everything up, and God's plan will not come to pass. That's a big risk that some, I think, some theologians would say, and certainly Kant is rolling over in his grave repeatedly at this whole anthropomorphizing of God. This idea that God and humans can be friends, Kant would have a huge problem with. God is so much beyond our ability to comprehend. I mean, it would be a bit like us being friends with a bacterium. You know, what kind of friendship can be achieved there? Not really much of one, because we can never really comprehend what God is like. And I think, personally, there's a little bit of dubious psycho-theorizing in Eleanor Stump's article. I mean, all of her advice about what makes a good friendship. I mean, for example, do you think, she says that it is good for someone, it is healthy for a friendship if you wait, if you don't do anything until the person asks. But don't you think a really close old friend of yours will do stuff for you without you asking? And you will say, well, I was going to ask for that. And you said, yeah, I knew you so well, I knew you'd ask for it, so I did it anyway. I mean, isn't that the sign of a friend who really knows you? Maybe at first, of course. In fact, you know, when you're making the friendship, maybe, or when you're just starting out, you don't want people to do stuff without asking. But pretty soon, I think, someone who keeps asking, it sounds like you're not really friends. If you say, well, I didn't want to do this without asking, it sounds like you're unsure of the relationship. It sounds like you're still on slightly formal terms. And I think, now, maybe that's because we're so unequal with God and we should never presume to be truly friends. But if you're going to characterize it as a friendship, then I think you want to get past that. If, you know, you start saying, well, I didn't want to presume, I didn't want to presume on your goodwill, then it sounds like there's something wrong with the friendship. It sounds like, you know, somebody's pissed at someone else. That would be my you know, armchair psychologizing, which, you know, you've seen Stump's armchair psychologizing. That would be mine. But anyway, that's her theory. Her theory is that there is a point to petitionary prayer, specifically asking for things. And notice it's, as she herself points out, it's kind of the reverse point that most people think. Most people think that asking for things is a way of getting closer to someone. But she says no, asking for things is like a buffer, having to ask for something is a safety buffer. If we didn't have to ask for something, then there would be this danger of being spoilt or being subsumed. Certainly an interesting theory. So there are the competing views of prayer. Notice that neither of them is presented by an atheist, because an atheist view of prayer is, of course, that it's pointless because you're talking to something that doesn't exist. These are two, they happen to be Christian, two Christian philosophers with very much opposed views on certainly petitionary prayer. Kant allows that prayer has some purpose, but not petitionary prayer. Petitionary prayer is presumptuous and insulting to God, according to him. All right, that should do it for prayer.